Detective Sarah Williams had always been a light sleeper. 20 years with the FBI had trained her mind to stay alert even during rest. But nothing could have prepared her for the thunderous banging that shattered the peaceful silence of her suburban home at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah jolted upright in her bed, her heart racing as the sound echoed through her modest two-story house in the quiet neighborhood of Riverside Heights. The banging wasn't random or desperate like someone seeking help. It was deliberate, aggressive, and carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. But Sarah knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She was law enforcement herself. Federal agents, open up immediately. The voice boomed from her front porch, followed by more violent pounding that seemed to shake the entire house. Sarah's mind raced as she grabbed her robe and moved toward the stairs. Federal agents? That couldn't be right. She was federal law enforcement. There had to be some mistake. The pounding intensified, and Sarah heard the distinct sound of her neighbor's porch lights clicking on one by one. Mrs. Henderson from next door was probably peeking through her curtains, and the young couple across the street were likely recording everything on their phones. This was exactly the kind of scene that would be neighborhood gossip for months. "I'm coming. Hold on," Sarah called out as she hurried down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floors. She could see flashlight beams dancing through her front windows, casting eerie shadows across her living room walls. The beams were bright and numerous, suggesting multiple officers. As she approached the front door, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the frosted glass panel beside her door, she could see the silhouettes of several figures. But these weren't federal agents. The body language, the equipment, even the way they stood screamed local law enforcement. And worse, she could make out the distinctive outline of someone holding what appeared to be a battering ram. "This is Detective Sarah Williams. I'm opening the door," she announced loudly, hoping to prevent what seemed inevitable. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the deadbolt. In all her years of law enforcement, she had been on the other side of doors like this hundreds of times. She knew the protocol, knew the intensity, knew the split-second decisions that could change everything. But before her fingers could even touch the lock, her worst fear became reality. The door exploded inward with tremendous force, the deadbolt and chain lock no match for the heavy battering ram. Sarah stumbled backward, her robe flying open as she tried to maintain her balance. Splinters of wood scattered across her entryway and the doorframe cracked with a sound like breaking bones. "Get down! Get down now!" Multiple voices shouted simultaneously as tactical officers in full gear poured through her destroyed doorway. Bright LED flashlights blinded her as she raised her hands instinctively, squinting against the harsh white light that filled her home. "I'm Detective Williams. FBI, there's been a mistake," Sarah shouted over the chaos, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of barked orders and heavy footsteps. She could see at least 6 officers, all dressed in tactical gear with HOA enforcement patches visible on their vests. HOA enforcement? That didn't make sense. Homeowners associations didn't have tactical teams. One of the officers, a tall man with a graying mustache, seemed to be in charge. He stepped forward, his weapon still drawn but pointed slightly downward. "Ma'am, we have reports of federal weapons being stored illegally on this property. We need you to comply with our search." Sarah's mind reeled. Federal weapons? She was authorized to carry federal weapons. She was federal law enforcement. "Officer, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. I'm Detective Sarah Williams with the FBI. My credentials are upstairs in my bedroom. I'm authorized to possess federal weapons." The lead officer's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, we've received multiple complaints from your homeowners association about suspicious federal activity at this address. Residents have reported seeing you in tactical gear, carrying weapons, and conducting what appeared to be surveillance activities." Surveillance activities? Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I live here." "I've lived here for 8 years. And yes, I sometimes wear tactical gear because I work for the FBI." Another officer, younger with nervous energy, piped up from near her living room. "Sir, neighbors reported seeing her cleaning weapons on her back porch last weekend. Said it made them uncomfortable, especially with children in the neighborhood." Sarah felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. "I was cleaning my service weapon, which I'm required to maintain as part of my job." "This is insane." The lead officer holstered his weapon but maintained his authoritative stance. "Ma'am, the Homeowners Association has very strict rules about federal law enforcement activities conducted on residential property. Even if you are who you say you are, you may be in violation of community standards. Community standards? Sarah's voice rose an octave. I'm a federal law enforcement officer. I live in this community. I pay my HOA fees just like everyone else. The officers began spreading throughout her home, their flashlights sweeping across her furniture, her family photos, her carefully maintained living space. Sarah watched in horror as they treated her home like a crime scene, their heavy boots tracking mud and debris from the broken door across her clean floors. Sir, you need to see this, called one of the officers from her kitchen. He was standing near her refrigerator, shining his light on something mounted on the wall. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what he was looking at. There, prominently displayed on her kitchen wall, was her FBI Academy graduation photo. Next to it hung her commendation letters, her service awards, and most prominently, her official FBI credentials in a frame. Below that was a shadow box containing her badge, her service pin, and a folded American flag from her father's military funeral. The lead officer moved toward the kitchen, his confidence seeming to waver for the first time since entering her home. The other officers followed, their flashlights now illuminating the unmistakable evidence of Sarah's federal law enforcement career. Is that? The younger officer started to say, his voice trailing off as he read the official seal on her credentials. Sarah straightened her robe and lifted her chin, finding her voice again. Yes, officer. That's my FBI jacket hanging right there next to my credentials. The same credentials I've been trying to tell you about. Since you broke down my door, the kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of static from their radios and the distant murmur of gathering neighbors outside. The silence in Sarah's kitchen stretched uncomfortably as the HOA enforcement officers stared at the wall displaying her federal credentials. The lead officer, who had introduced himself as Captain Rodriguez, cleared his throat and stepped closer to examine the framed documents. His flashlight beam moved slowly across each certificate, commendation, and official seal. Ma'am, Captain Rodriguez began, his tone noticeably different from the aggressive commands he had been barking moments earlier. These appear to be legitimate federal credentials. Sarah crossed her arms, her initial shock giving way to controlled anger. They are legitimate because I am legitimate. I've been telling you that since you broke down my door. She gestured toward the splintered wood and broken hardware scattered across her entryway. A door, I might add, that I'm going to expect someone to pay to repair. Officer Martinez, the younger man who had been so eager to search her property, was now studying her FBI Academy graduation photo with obvious discomfort. Captain, this says she graduated from Quantico in 2003. That's 20 years of service. I can read. Martinez, Rodriguez snapped, then turned back to Sarah. Detective Williams, we received complaints from the Riverside Heights Homeowners Association Board. They said residents were concerned about federal law enforcement activities being conducted at this address without proper notification to the community. Sarah felt her blood pressure rising. Proper notification? I live here. I've lived here for 8 years. I bought this house specifically because it was in a quiet neighborhood where I could have some peace between assignments. What kind of notification am I supposed to give? Put up a sign that says FBI agent lives here? Captain Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. The HOA has strict regulations about business activities conducted on residential property. Some residents interpreted your professional activities as a violation of those regulations. Professional activities? Sarah's voice was getting louder. You mean like cleaning my service weapon, which every federal agent is required to do? Or maybe you mean the time I came home in my tactical gear after a 14-hour surveillance operation and didn't have time to change before getting my mail. Officer Martinez pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. According to the complaint filed last week, Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down reported seeing you in full tactical gear entering and leaving your residence at unusual hours. She said you appeared to be conducting surveillance on the neighborhood. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Surveillance on the neighborhood? I was coming home from work. And for your information, unusual hours are normal for federal agents. We don't work 9 to 5. Another officer who had been quietly examining the credentials on the wall spoke up. Captain, look at this commendation. It's from the director of the FBI himself. Says here she received recognition for her work on a major organized crime investigation that resulted in 47 arrests. Captain Rodriguez moved closer to read the commendation letter. Sarah watched his expression change as he read the details of her service record. The document detailed her work on high-profile cases, her specialized training in financial crimes, and her exemplary service record spanning 2 decades. "There's more," the officer continued, pointing to another framed certificate. "Counterterrorism training, advanced firearms instructor certification, and... Captain, she's been decorated for bravery under fire." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction watching the officers realize the magnitude of their mistake. "Yes, that decoration was for an incident 3 years ago when my partner and I were ambushed during a raid on a drug operation. I took 2 rounds in my vest and still managed to apprehend the suspect." The kitchen fell silent again. Outside, Sarah could hear the murmur of neighbors gathering on the street. Red and blue lights from the multiple police vehicles were still flashing through her windows, casting strange patterns on the walls of her home. Officer Martinez cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, about the weapons complaint." "What weapons complaint?" Sarah demanded. "Mrs. Patterson also reported that she saw you carrying what appeared to be military-style weapons into your residence. She was concerned about the safety of the children in the neighborhood." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Military-style weapons? You mean my service pistol and my backup weapon? Both of which I'm required to carry and maintain as a federal agent?" Captain Rodriguez was now studying a photograph of Sarah shaking hands with the Attorney General. "Detective Williams, I'm beginning to think there's been a serious misunderstanding here." "You think?" Sarah's sarcasm was sharp. "A misunderstanding that resulted in you breaking down my door at 2 a.m. and treating me like a criminal in my own home." Another officer had moved to the living room and was examining more photographs on Sarah's mantle. "Captain, you need to see this. She's got photos with half the law enforcement leadership in the state. Here's one with the chief of police, one with the sheriff, and... Is that the governor?" Sarah followed them into the living room. "Yes, that's the governor. It was taken at a law enforcement appreciation dinner last year. The one where I received recognition for my work on the task force that broke up that human trafficking ring." Captain Rodriguez was beginning to look sick. "Detective Williams, I want you to know that we were acting on what we believe to be legitimate complaints from concerned citizens." "Concerned citizens?" Sarah interrupted. "Or concerned neighbors who decided they didn't like having a federal agent living in their perfect little suburban community?" Officer Martinez had gone pale. "Captain, what if this gets back to the FBI? What if they file a complaint against the department?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What if I file a complaint? What if I contact my supervisor and explain that the local HOA enforcement team broke down my door in the middle of the night because I have the audacity to live in this neighborhood while being a federal agent?" The weight of the situation was clearly settling on Captain Rodriguez. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for this situation. If you could just verify your identity with your credentials." "My credentials are hanging on the wall where you're all staring at them," Sarah said coldly. "But if you want additional verification, my badge and ID are upstairs in my bedroom safe. Of course, I would have gotten them for you immediately if you had asked instead of breaking down my door." Captain Rodriguez nodded to Officer Martinez. "Go with Detective Williams to verify her credentials. Everyone else, start documenting everything for the report." As they headed toward the stairs, Sarah paused. "Captain Rodriguez, I want you to understand something. I've served this country for 20 years. I've put my life on the line countless times to protect citizens like the ones who complained about me. And tonight, those same citizens have subjected me to the kind of treatment I've seen given to actual criminals." The captain looked down at his boots. "Ma'am, we were just doing our job based on the information we received." "Your job," Sarah said slowly, "is supposed to include using good judgment and common sense. Breaking down doors should be a last resort, not the first option when responding to neighbor complaints about someone existing while being a federal agent." As they climbed the stairs, Sarah could hear the other officers talking quietly among themselves in her living room. She caught fragments of their conversation. 20 years of service, decorated agent, and this is going to be a nightmare. She smiled grimly to herself. Their nightmare was just beginning. Sarah led Officer Martinez up the stairs to her bedroom, her bare feet still cold against the hardwood. The young officer followed nervously, his radio crackling with static as other units continued to arrive outside. Through her bedroom window, Sarah could see the growing crowd of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the red and blue emergency lights. "The safe is in the closet," Sarah said, moving toward her walk-in closet. I keep all my official documents and service weapons secured when I'm off duty, as required by federal regulations. Officer Martinez watched as Sarah knelt beside a heavy black safe mounted to the floor. She quickly entered the combination, and the thick door swung open to reveal her FBI badge, backup credentials, service weapon, and various official documents. Here, Sarah said, handing him her official FBI identification card and badge. This should clear up any remaining doubts about who I am. Martinez examined the credentials carefully, comparing the photo to Sarah's face. His hands were shaking slightly as he read her full title. Special Agent Sarah Williams, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. Ma'am, he said quietly, I want you to know that I'm really sorry about this. I've only been with the HOA enforcement team for 6 months. I was told we were responding to reports of illegal weapon storage. Sarah studied the young officer's face. Despite her anger, she could see genuine remorse in his eyes. How old are you, Martinez? 24, ma'am. Have you ever heard of community policing? Building relationships with the people you serve rather than just responding to complaints with overwhelming force? Martinez nodded uncomfortably. Yes, ma'am. They taught us about that in the academy. Then perhaps you can explain to me why your first instinct was to break down my door instead of knocking and asking to speak with me. Captain Rodriguez said the complaints indicated potential federal weapons violations. He said we needed to secure the scene immediately to prevent evidence destruction. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. Evidence destruction of what? My legally owned service weapons that I'm required to possess as a federal agent? They could hear Captain Rodriguez calling from downstairs. Martinez, bring those credentials down here. As they descended the stairs, Sarah noticed that more officers had arrived. Her living room now contained at least 8 uniformed personnel, all looking distinctly uncomfortable as they stood among the evidence of her distinguished law enforcement career. Captain Rodriguez was on his radio when they entered the room. Yes, sir, confirmed federal agent. 20-year veteran. No, sir, she's legitimate. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Yes, sir. I understand. We'll handle it appropriately. He ended the call and turned to Sarah. Detective Williams, that was my supervisor. He's on his way to the scene. Good, Sarah replied curtly. I want to speak with him about your department's procedures for responding to HOA complaints. Officer Martinez handed the credentials to his captain, who examined them thoroughly before passing them back to Sarah. Ma'am, these credentials appear to be in order. I want to apologize for the confusion. Confusion? Sarah's voice rose. Captain, you broke down my door. You treated me like a criminal in my own home. You violated my civil rights based on complaints from neighbors who apparently think being a federal agent is suspicious behavior. Another officer near the kitchen spoke up. Captain, I've been looking at more of her commendations. She's received the FBI Medal of Valor, the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service, and the Presidential Medal for Counterterrorism Efforts. Captain Rodriguez was beginning to look physically ill. Detective Williams, I want you to know that we take citizen complaints seriously, but clearly there was a significant breakdown in our assessment of the situation. A breakdown? Sarah laughed harshly. Captain, let me explain something to you. I've conducted hundreds of search warrants in my career. I know the difference between a legitimate law enforcement operation and a cluster of mistakes masquerading as police work. The front door opened, and a man in a chief's uniform entered, stepping carefully around the broken door frame. He was older, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen enough police work to know when things had gone wrong. Which one of you is Detective Williams? He asked. Sarah stepped forward. I am, and you are? Chief Patterson, Riverside Heights Police Department. I want to apologize for this situation. Patterson? Sarah's eyes narrowed. Any relation to the Mrs. Patterson who filed the complaints about me? The chief's face reddened slightly. She's my wife, and I want you to know that she acted without my knowledge or approval when she contacted the HOA enforcement team. The room fell silent. Sarah felt her anger crystallizing into something cold and focused. So your wife decided she didn't like having an FBI agent in the neighborhood, and your officers responded by breaking down my door? Detective Williams, I want to assure you that this was not authorized or approved by my department. The HOA enforcement team operates independently. But they're sworn police officers, aren't they? Sarah interrupted. Wearing police uniforms, carrying police weapons, and acting under the authority of law enforcement? Chief Patterson nodded reluctantly. Yes, they are. Then they represent your department. Chief? And tonight your department violated my constitutional rights based on the personal prejudices of your wife. Captain Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Chief, Detective Williams is demanding accountability for the damage to her property and the violation of her rights. Sarah turned to face the entire group of officers. Let me make something very clear to all of you. I've spent 20 years serving this country. I've been shot at, threatened, and put my life on the line more times than I can count. And tonight, the biggest threat to my safety and civil rights came from my own neighbors and local law enforcement. Officer Martinez spoke up nervously. Ma'am, what are you going to do? Are you going to report this to the FBI? Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Officer Martinez, I am the FBI, at least in this jurisdiction. And yes, this incident will be reported through proper channels. Chief Patterson pulled out his cell phone. Detective Williams, I'd like to call my supervisor and explain this situation immediately. Perhaps we can work out some kind of resolution. Resolution? Sarah's voice was ice cold. Chief, the resolution is simple. Your department is going to pay for my door. You're going to conduct a thorough investigation into how this happened. And you're going to ensure that every officer involved receives additional training on civil rights and proper police procedures. The chief nodded quickly. Of course. Whatever you think is appropriate. And one more thing, Sarah continued. I want to know exactly what complaints your wife filed and why she thought it was appropriate to weaponize law enforcement against a federal agent for the crime of living in her neighborhood, Captain. Rodriguez cleared his throat. Ma'am, about Mrs. Patterson's complaints. Yes? She specifically mentioned that she felt uncomfortable with a federal agent living so close to her family. She said it made the neighborhood feel unsafe. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Unsafe? A federal law enforcement officer made her feel unsafe? She was concerned about retaliation from criminals you might have arrested. She thought your presence put other residents at risk. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. So she decided to put me at risk instead by sicking a tactical team on me in the middle of the night, Chief. Patterson was dialing his phone. Detective Williams, I'm calling the mayor and the city manager. This needs to be addressed at the highest levels. As the chief stepped away to make his calls, Sarah looked around her damaged home. The broken door, the scattered wood splinters, the muddy boot prints across her floors, all because some neighbors decided that having an FBI agent in their community was more dangerous than the criminals she spent her career fighting. Captain Rodriguez, she said, quietly. Yes, ma'am. In your 20 years of law enforcement, have you ever seen anything this ridiculous? The captain looked down at his boots. No, ma'am, I have not. Chief Patterson finished his phone call and returned to Sarah's living room, his expression grave. Detective Williams, I've spoken with both the mayor and my immediate supervisor at the state police. They're both extremely concerned about this incident. Sarah was sitting on her couch now, having finally been allowed to put on proper clothes. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, analytical mindset that had served her well during countless investigations. And what did they say? The mayor wants to meet with you personally to apologize and discuss how to prevent this from happening again. My supervisor is launching an immediate investigation into our HOA enforcement protocols. Captain Rodriguez, who had been unusually quiet since realizing the magnitude of their mistake, cleared his throat. Chief, what about Mrs. Patterson's complaint? Should we be looking into that as well? Chief Patterson's jaw tightened. Mrs. Patterson's complaint will be handled internally. And I want to be clear that her personal opinions about federal agents do not represent the views of this department or this community. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Personal opinions? Chief, your wife filed a false complaint that resulted in a tactical response against a federal agent. This goes beyond personal opinions. You're absolutely right, the chief admitted. And there will be consequences. Officer Martinez, who had been standing near the broken door frame, spoke up hesitantly. Ma'am, I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about community policing and building relationships. We really messed that up tonight, didn't we? Sarah looked at the young officer with something approaching sympathy. Martinez, let me ask you something. In the 6 months you've been with the HOA enforcement team, how many doors have you broken down? Tonight was actually my first time using the battering ram, he admitted. And how many times have you knocked on someone's door and simply talked to them about a complaint? Martinez thought for a moment. Honestly, never. Captain Rodriguez always says we need to approach situations with authority to maintain control. Sarah turned to Captain Rodriguez. Is that your standard protocol, Captain? Authority first, communication never? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. We deal with a lot of hostile situations. People don't like being confronted about HOA violations. HOA violations, Sarah repeated slowly. Captain, what exactly was I accused of violating? Rodriguez pulled out a clipboard with several sheets of paper. According to the complaint filed by Mrs. Patterson, you were in violation of Section 12.3 of the Riverside Heights HOA agreement, which prohibits business activities on residential property. She claimed you were operating some kind of federal law enforcement business out of your home. Sarah stared at him. Operating a business? I live here. I work for the federal government. I don't operate any business. She also cited Section 15.7, which requires residents to notify the HOA board of any activities that might impact community safety or property values, such as having weapons on the property or conducting surveillance activities. Sarah felt her anger building again. Captain, every police officer in this city has weapons at their home. Do they all notify the HOA? And what surveillance activities? Living in my own house? Chief Patterson intervened. Detective Williams, it's becoming clear that the complaints against you were baseless and possibly motivated by bias. Bias? Sarah stood up and walked to her mantel, picking up a framed photo of herself with other FBI agents at a community outreach event. Chief, let's call it what it is. Your wife saw a black woman in federal law enforcement gear and decided I must be up to something criminal. The room fell silent. Several officers looked down at their feet, clearly uncomfortable with the truth Sarah had just spoken. She didn't even try to get to know me, Sarah continued. Didn't ask questions, didn't introduce herself, didn't attempt any kind of neighborly communication. She went straight to filing complaints designed to get law enforcement to harass me. Officer Martinez spoke up quietly. Ma'am, how do you think we should have handled Mrs. Patterson's complaints? Sarah looked at him appraisingly. Good question, Martinez. First, someone should have done basic fact-checking. A simple database search would have shown that I'm a federal agent, legally residing at this address. Second, someone should have knocked on my door and talked to me directly. Third, someone should have asked Mrs. Patterson for specific evidence of wrongdoing rather than accepting vague complaints about suspicious federal activity. Captain Rodriguez was taking notes. Those are all valid points. But most importantly, Sarah continued, someone should have recognized that Mrs. Patterson's complaints were based on assumptions and prejudices rather than actual observed criminal behavior. Chief Patterson nodded. You're absolutely right. And I want you to know that this incident is going to result in significant changes to our procedures. What kind of changes? Sarah asked. First, all HOA enforcement actions will now require approval from a senior supervisor before any tactical response is authorized. Second, we're implementing mandatory de-escalation training for all officers involved in community policing activities. Third, we're establishing a civilian oversight committee to review complaints against residents. Sarah walked back to her kitchen and looked at her FBI credentials hanging on the wall. Chief, I appreciate those changes, but they don't address the fundamental problem here. Which is? The fundamental problem is that your officers treated me like a criminal because they couldn't imagine that a black woman in their suburban neighborhood might actually be one of the good guys. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear the clock ticking on her kitchen wall and the distant sound of neighbors still gathered outside. Officer Martinez broke the silence. Ma'am, you're right, and I'm ashamed that I participated in that. Sarah turned to look at him. Martinez, what are you going to do differently next time? I'm going to ask questions before I make assumptions. I'm going to remember that the people we serve are human beings who deserve respect and dignity. Good answer, Sarah said. What about the rest of you? One by one, the other officers acknowledged their mistakes and committed to doing better. Captain Rodriguez was the last to speak. Detective Williams, I've been a cop for 25 years, and tonight I learned that experience doesn't excuse bad judgment. I should have questioned Mrs. Patterson's complaints more thoroughly, and I should have approached this situation with more intelligence and less force. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's a start, Captain. Chief Patterson's phone rang again. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned to Sarah. That was the FBI field office. Apparently, your supervisor has been trying to reach you. Sarah checked her own phone and saw several missed calls and text messages. They probably heard about the police activity at my address through automatic monitoring systems. What are you going to tell them? Captain Rodriguez asked nervously. Sarah smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. I'm going to tell them the truth, Captain. That local law enforcement broke down my door because a neighbor complained about me existing while being a federal agent. The officers exchanged worried glances. They were beginning to understand that their nightmare was far from over. Sarah returned her supervisor's call while the local officers continued to document the scene and take photographs of the damage to her home. Assistant Director Marcus Thompson had been her mentor for 15 years, and she could hear the barely controlled anger in his voice when she explained what had happened. They did what? Thompson's voice came through the speaker clearly enough for several of the local officers to hear. Sarah, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Marcus. Physically, anyway. But my front door is destroyed. My home has been turned upside down, and I've been treated like a criminal by local law enforcement, based on neighbor complaints about my existence. I'm sending Agent Chen and a crime scene team to document everything. This is going to be investigated as a potential civil rights violation. Chief Patterson visibly paled when he heard this. Detective Williams, perhaps we could resolve this without involving additional federal agencies. Sarah held up her hand for silence while continuing her conversation with Thompson. Marcus, the most disturbing part is that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or bad intelligence. They knew I was claiming to be FBI. They just didn't believe me and didn't bother to verify before breaking down my door. What's the name of the local chief? Chief Patterson. And get this, his wife is the one who filed the complaints about me. The silence on the phone was telling. Finally, Thompson spoke again. Sarah, I want you to know that this is going to have consequences at the highest levels. The director is going to want a full report. After ending the call, Sarah turned to Chief Patterson. Chief, in about 30 minutes, this is going to become a federal investigation. I suggest you start preparing your incident reports very carefully. Captain Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. Ma'am, what exactly does that mean for us? It means, Captain, that every decision you made tonight is going to be scrutinized by federal investigators who specialize in civil rights violations. Every radio transmission, every tactical decision, every assumption you made, all of it will be examined. Officer Martinez raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what should we do now? Sarah considered the question carefully. Despite her anger, she recognized that several of the officers, particularly Martinez, seemed genuinely remorseful and eager to learn from their mistakes. Right now, you should be thinking about how to prevent this from happening to anyone else. Because this isn't just about me, and it's not just about federal agents. This is about how your department responds to complaints about people who don't fit someone's idea of what belongs in their neighborhood. Chief Patterson was pacing near the broken door. Detective Williams, I want to be completely transparent with you. My wife has made similar complaints about other residents in the past. Always about people she considers different or suspicious, such as the Martinez family who moved in last year. She complained they were running an illegal business because they had family gatherings on weekends. The young couple with the electric car. She said it was suspicious that they came and went at odd hours. The retired veteran who sometimes wears camouflage clothing. She reported him as a potential security threat. Sarah shook her head in disgust. And how did your department respond to those complaints? We investigated each one and found no wrongdoing. But we never used tactical response for any of those situations. So what made my case different, Chief? The chief looked down at his hands. Honestly, when my wife mentioned federal weapons and surveillance activities, Captain Rodriguez recommended a tactical approach to ensure officer safety. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. Chief, that's not entirely accurate. When dispatch said we had reports of federal weapons violations, I assumed we were dealing with stolen federal property or unauthorized possession of federal equipment. I didn't take the time to consider that there might be a legitimate explanation. Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the crowd of neighbors still gathered on the street. You want to know what's really disturbing about all of this? Those neighbors out there have been living next to me for 8 years. 8 years. And not one of them knows what I do for a living because not one of them has ever bothered to have a conversation with me. Officer Martinez joined her at the window. Ma'am, why do you think that is? Because I'm different, Martinez. I'm a black woman living alone in a predominantly white upper-middle-class neighborhood. To some people, that automatically makes me suspicious. But you're FBI, Martinez protested. Exactly my point, Sarah replied. I'm FBI, and they still called the police on me. What does that tell you about their assumptions? The young officer was quiet for a long moment, processing this. It tells me that maybe being law enforcement doesn't protect you from prejudice. Now you're starting to understand. Chief Patterson finished another phone call and approached them. Detective Williams, that was the mayor again. He wants to hold a community meeting to address this incident and the broader issues it represents. What kind of community meeting? He's proposing a forum where residents can meet with law enforcement and discuss community policing, civil rights, and how to handle neighbor concerns appropriately. Sarah considered this. That might be helpful, but only if it's done right. This can't be a feel-good publicity event where everyone pretends this was just a misunderstanding. What would you want to see happen? I want honest conversations about bias, prejudice, and how they affect law enforcement decisions. I want training for both officers and community members about civil rights and proper procedures. And I want accountability for what happened here tonight. Captain Rodriguez was still taking notes. Ma'am, would you be willing to participate in that training? To help us understand how we went wrong? Sarah looked at him carefully. Captain, are you asking me to fix the problem that your department created? No, ma'am. I'm asking for your help to make sure this never happens to anyone else. The distinction was important, and Sarah appreciated that Rodriguez understood it. I'll consider it. But any training program needs to be comprehensive and ongoing, not just a one-time event to make people feel better. Agent Chen arrived with 2 other FBI agents and a crime scene photographer. Sarah introduced them to the local officers and explained the situation. Agent Chen, a soft-spoken but thorough investigator, immediately began documenting everything with the precision of someone who had handled many civil rights cases. Detective Williams, Agent Chen said as she photographed the broken door, I want you to know that we're going to be very thorough in our investigation. This kind of incident cannot be allowed to stand without consequences. Chief Patterson approached Agent Chen. Agent, I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. We've already begun our own internal review of the incident. That's appreciated, Chief, but understand that our investigation will be independent and comprehensive. We'll be reviewing all communications, all training records, all previous incidents involving HOA complaints, and all personnel involved. Officer Martinez looked nervous. Agent Chen, what happens to officers who made mistakes but are genuinely trying to learn from them? Agent Chen studied the young officer. That depends on the nature of the mistakes and the evidence of genuine accountability. Intent matters, but so do actions and their consequences. Sarah watched the interaction with interest. Martinez seemed to be taking this seriously, while some of the other officers appeared more concerned about covering themselves than learning from their errors. Agent Chen, Sarah said, I want to make sure your investigation looks at the systemic issues here, not just the individual decisions made tonight. Absolutely. We'll be examining training protocols, complaint handling procedures, use of force policies, and community relations practices. Chief Patterson pulled Sarah aside. Detective Williams, I want you to know that regardless of what the federal investigation finds, our department is committed to making changes. This incident has opened my eyes to problems I didn't know existed. Such as the fact that my wife has been filing discriminatory complaints for years, and I never recognized the pattern. Such as the fact that my officers are trained to use force first and ask questions later. Such as the fact that we've never really examined our own biases and how they affect our policing. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's a good start, Chief. But change requires more than recognition. It requires action, accountability, and ongoing commitment. I understand. And I want you to know that my wife will be held accountable for her role in this incident. How? She'll be required to attend sensitivity training, perform community service with local civil rights organizations, and issue a public apology to you and the community. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And if she refuses? Chief Patterson's expression was grim. Then our marriage will have bigger problems than her prejudices. The seriousness in his voice told Sarah that he was beginning to understand the true gravity of what had happened. This wasn't just a professional embarrassment. It was a fundamental challenge to his values and his relationships. 3 months after the incident, Sarah stood in the Riverside Heights Community Center facing a packed auditorium. The monthly community meeting had become a forum for ongoing discussions about policing, civil rights, and community relations. What had started as damage control had evolved into something more meaningful. Officer Martinez, now promoted to community relations specialist, sat in the front row with his notebook ready. He had become one of the most vocal advocates for police reform within the department, using his experience from that night as a teaching tool for other officers. Tonight, we're discussing the progress made since the incident at Detective Williams's home, announced Mayor Davidson, a woman in her 50s who had taken the situation seriously from the beginning. We've implemented several significant changes, but this is an ongoing process, not a destination. Sarah had been invited to speak about her experience and the changes she wanted to see. As she approached the podium, she noticed several familiar faces in the audience, some supportive, some still skeptical, but all present and engaged. 3 months ago, my front door was broken down by local police responding to complaints that I existed while being a federal agent, Sarah began, her voice clear and steady. Tonight I want to talk about what we've learned and what still needs to change. Chief Patterson, who had survived the internal investigation but faced significant sanctions, listened intently from his seat near the back. His wife had moved out 6 weeks earlier, unable to accept responsibility for her role in the incident. The divorce papers had been filed the previous month. The most important change, Sarah continued, is that this community has started having conversations it should have been having for years. About bias, about assumptions, about what it means to belong in a neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's elderly neighbor, stood up. Detective Williams, I want to publicly apologize for never introducing myself in 8 years. I was afraid of bothering you, but I realize now that I was just making assumptions about what kind of person you might be. Sarah smiled at the older woman. Mrs. Henderson, thank you for that. And I want to apologize, too, for never reaching out either. We both made assumptions about each other. Agent Chen was also in attendance, monitoring the community's progress as part of the ongoing federal oversight. The civil rights investigation had resulted in a consent decree requiring the police department to implement comprehensive reforms under federal supervision. Martinez raised his hand. Detective Williams, can you talk about the training program you helped develop? The training program focuses on 3 key areas, Sarah explained. First, implicit bias recognition, helping officers understand how their assumptions affect their decisions. Second, de-escalation techniques that prioritize communication over force. Third, community engagement strategies that build relationships before problems arise. Captain Rodriguez, who had been demoted but retained after demonstrating genuine commitment to reform, spoke from the audience. The training has been eye-opening for all of us. We're learning to see situations from perspectives we never considered before. A woman Sarah didn't recognize stood up. I'm Lisa Patterson. No relation to the former Mrs. Patterson. I want to know what happens when residents file complaints now. Chief Patterson answered this question. We've implemented a 3-tier response system. First, all complaints are reviewed by a supervisor for legitimacy and bias indicators. Second, we attempt community mediation before any enforcement action. Third, any tactical response requires approval from both a senior supervisor and the Community Oversight Board. And it's working, added Martinez. We've had 47 HOA-related complaints since the new system was implemented. 45 were resolved through communication and mediation. Only 2 required any enforcement action, and both involved actual criminal behavior. Sarah was impressed by the statistics. That's exactly what community policing should look like, solving problems through relationships and communication rather than force. An older man near the back raised his hand. Detective Williams, what advice do you have for residents who see something they think is suspicious? Ask yourself 3 questions, Sarah replied. First, what specific behavior concerns you? Not assumptions about someone's appearance or lifestyle, but actual observed actions. Second, have you tried talking to the person directly to understand what you're seeing? Third, are you calling the police because of legitimate safety concerns or because someone doesn't fit your expectations for the neighborhood? A young mother with 2 children spoke up. My kids have been asking about what happened that night. How do I explain police and safety to them now? Sarah considered the question carefully. Tell them the truth, that police officers are human beings who make mistakes. But that doesn't mean all police are bad, or that we don't need law enforcement. Tell them that real safety comes from communities where people know each other, communicate with each other, and solve problems together. Agent Chen stood to provide an update on the federal investigation. The civil rights review is ongoing, but I can report that this community has made remarkable progress in a short time. The changes implemented here are being studied as a model for other departments facing similar challenges. Mayor Davidson took the podium again. I want to address something important. Some people have asked why we're continuing these meetings now that the immediate crisis has passed. The answer is simple. Real change doesn't happen overnight, and maintaining progress requires constant attention. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. The test of any reform effort is whether it survives when the spotlight moves on to other issues. A teenager near the front raised her hand. Detective Williams, do you still feel safe living in this neighborhood? The question prompted a moment of silence. Sarah looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had become neighbors rather than strangers over the past 3 months. I feel safer now than I did before the incident, she said finally. Not because the police have changed, although they have, but because this community has chosen to confront its problems rather than ignore them. Martinez stood up. Detective Williams, I want to thank you for not giving up on us. You could have transferred, filed lawsuits, or just written us off as hopeless. Instead, you stayed and helped us become better. I stayed because this is my home, Sarah replied, and because real change requires people to stay and do the hard work, rather than running away when things get difficult. Chief Patterson approached the microphone. I want to close tonight by acknowledging something important. 3 months ago, we failed Detective Williams and we failed this community. But failure only becomes permanent when you stop trying to do better. The work continues. As the meeting ended, people lingered to continue conversations in smaller groups. Sarah found herself surrounded by neighbors she was finally getting to know. The retired teacher who had been afraid to approach her, the young couple who had assumed she was unfriendly, the families who had never considered what it might be like to be the only person of color on a street. Martinez approached her as the crowd thinned. Ma'am, I have a question that's been bothering me. What's that? Do you think we would have learned these lessons if this incident hadn't happened? Sarah considered the question seriously. Probably not. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force people to examine systems and attitudes they've been taking for granted. So in a weird way, maybe some good came out of a terrible situation. Some good has come out of the work we've all done since the terrible situation, Sarah corrected. The incident itself was just a wake-up call. The good has come from how people chose to respond to that wake-up call. As Sarah walked home that evening, she passed her front door, now repaired and equipped with better security, but more importantly, a door that neighbors felt welcome to knock on. The porch light illuminated a small sign she had installed. Detective Sarah Williams, BI, proud to serve this community. It was a simple gesture, but it represented something profound. The difference between hiding who you are and being proud of your service, between living among strangers and being part of a community, between accepting broken systems and working to fix them. The work was far from over, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she truly belonged in the neighborhood she had called home for 8 years, and perhaps more importantly, her neighbors finally understood what it meant to have an FBI agent living among them. Not as a threat to be feared, but as a neighbor to be valued, and a professional to be respected. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a conference room full of retail executives, law enforcement officers, and social service professionals, presenting the results of her pilot program for criminal intervention and redirection. The program had successfully helped 12 individuals transition from criminal activity to legitimate employment, with a success rate that exceeded everyone's expectations. The key insight, Sarah explained to her audience, is that most theft isn't motivated by greed. It's motivated by desperation. When we address the underlying problems that drive people to steal, we don't just reduce crime, we transform lives. As she concluded her presentation, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had gone from being a desperate thief to becoming a respected expert in crime prevention and intervention. The skills that had once put her at risk of prison were now helping to keep others out of prison. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that everyone deserves a second chance, and that even the most difficult circumstances can be transformed into opportunities for growth and positive change. She had thought she could get away with stealing forever, but discovering who really owned that electronics store, had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her.